Hello, everyone. Welcome to the April webinar of the Task Force for American Democracy. I am Mary Smith, President of the Task Force and a past President of the American Bar Association. This webinar is part of the Task Force for American Democracy's special focus on elections this year. And so in the run-up to the 2026 midterms, the task force is conducting a special series of programs with a focus on elections and voting. And this is our first program in the series. And our main topic today is to explore a case currently pending at the U.S. Supreme Court, RNC versus Watson. This case could impact the voting rights of millions of Americans. Many states, the District of Columbia, and U.S. territories have what are called grace period laws that allow at least some voters' mail ballots to count when they are sent in by Election Day and arrive within a few days after Election Day. In 2024, a federal appeals court ruled that this century-old federal law setting a day for the election prohibits states mail grace periods. That ruling resulted from a lawsuit filed by the Republican National Committee. With the midterms right around the corner and the first primaries just a couple months away and a few of them concluded already, a decision striking down these grace periods could cause confusion for voters and election officials. So here we are today, and I would like to introduce our two amazing panelists. First panelist is a member of the task force, Vikram David Amar. He is the Daniel J. Dykstra Endowed Chair and Distinguished Professor of Law at UC Davis School of Law. From 2015 to 2023, he was the Dean and Ewan Foundation Professor of Law at the College of Law at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. He is the author of several books, including various volumes of Wright and Miller that we're all familiar with for civil procedure. And he has over 100 academic articles and chapters. He also writes a widely read biweekly column focusing on constitutional matters for justia.com. Our other panelist today is Jason Mazzone. He is the Albert E. Jenner Jr. Professor of Law at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and Director of the Illinois Program in Constitutional Theory, History, and Law. His scholarship is constitutional law and history, and he has been published in the nation's leading law journals and cited by many courts. He is a member of the American Law Institute, a fellow of the European Law Institute, and a founding member of the International Association of Constitutional Law Research Group on Constitutionalism in a Liberal Democracies. He's a regular media commentator and has written about legal issues for the New York Times and other papers. So with that, today I will, if you have questions during the program, I will be looking at the Q&A throughout, and we also will save a little bit of time at the end for questions. So with that, welcome Vic and Jason. We're so glad to have you today. And I know today our main topic is RNC versus Watson, but since we're talking just mere hours after oral arguments in the birthright citizen case, I thought I would ask you two to give your thoughts on what we've heard from the oral arguments. I don't know, Vic, did you want to start?
Sure. Thank you, Mary, and thank you for convening this important and hopefully illuminating event. I listened to the entirety of the oral argument, and I wasn't in the room. I talked to some people who were in the room who gave me an indication of the body language of the justices, which is sometimes revealing as well. I would say that the questioning was a little bit more restrained than I expected on both sides. Neither of the oralists, Solicitor General Sauer for the federal government and Cecilia Wong for the ACLU, neither of them were treated particularly harshly. I think it's an uphill battle for the Solicitor General. If I had to guess from the things that the court asked and what they didn't ask, is that there's likely to be a large supermajority, maybe even all nine or perhaps seven or eight that will rule against the president's executive order on the ground that it violates the congressional statute passed in 1940 and 1952, the Immigration and Naturalization Act. And that there'll be some justices, but maybe not five, who then go farther and opine on the Constitution and Section 1 of the 14th Amendment and its citizenship clause. So I think the president will lose. The executive order will be struck down. But my guess is we may not have five justices who want to invalidate it on the basis of the Constitution. And I say that in part because there were very few questions about the statutory challenge, which itself is very forceful. And Jason and I have written about that together. And I think if the justices were inclined to reject that statutory challenge and rule in Solicitor General Sauer's favor on the statutes, they would have had to ask a lot of questions of both advocates in order to help them write an opinion.
Jason, did you have any other thoughts or observations from the
So the fact
argument
that they didn't
today?
seem interested in
Yeah, Vic and I talked a little bit before the session, and so we're sort of on. I think we're on the same page. I actually thought it was a fairly sleepy argument in some ways compared to some other arguments in some of the other more recent cases. I mean, a lot of the press, I think, leading up to this has suggested this is a close case, very strong arguments on both sides, academics on both sides. I never really thought that was true. I mean, there were certainly arguments on both sides. I didn't think they were good arguments on the side in support of the president's order. And I think that maybe explains the what I thought was a fairly sleepy argument. I think Vic is probably right that you're going to get a majority on the statutory question as the easiest way to decide the case. Justices generally prefer to decide things on statutory grounds. And I think you'll get some concurring opinions that are also rest upon the 14th Amendment issue. But I have no doubt after this argument that the executive order is going down.
Well, one other aspect of today, which also impacts voting because whoever's a citizen can vote, was the fact that for the first time in history, a U.S. president actually attended the argument. So I'll ask both of you to reflect on that. Jason, what are your thoughts about the president attending the argument?
I was a little surprised, but I was more surprised to learn that this was the first time that a president had attended an argument. There are lots of cases historically, of course, in which presidents have a very strong interest in their policies, and so I was surprised that we don't have an earlier practice of that occurring. And I don't think it's a bad thing, to have the executive sitting in the Supreme Court. You don't want the person standing up and interrupting, but as an observer, I think that that makes sense. Show respect to the court, its role in our constitutional democracy. I was a little taken aback that, at least according to news reports, President Trump left right after the Solicitor General's argument. I think if you're going to attend an argument, you sit through the whole thing and hear both sides. That's normally how it works. But I think, good to see him there.
Well, you're saying it's good to see him there, that he has any right as anyone to watch an argument. I'll ask Vic. I've heard some commentators say that it's inappropriate that the president was there because of the separation of powers and things like that. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I think it's not in the abstract inappropriate, and indeed maybe it's particularly appropriate for the president to understand more about how this other branch of government operates. And I think all of us as lawyers, and even presidents who aren't lawyers, they learn about the court not just from its written opinions, but also from the oral argument. So I think, as a general matter, if presidents were going more frequently, and if this is the start of a new tradition, that's great. I think the problem is there hasn't been a tradition of that up till this point, and so someone could rightly construe President Trump's attendance today as kind of if not threatening, an assertive gesture that he wants the court to know that they'd be repudiating him personally by striking down this order. I have to say, I don't think that the president's presence affected any of the questioning. The justices are pretty good at doing their job, and I didn't sense any sycophantism or any particular hostility from the liberal justices in this argument, simply because the president, who's a contentious figure, of course, was there.
Well, thanks so much to both of you to taking a little time to talk about the case of the day. But back to the main topic of this webinar, the RNC versus Watson. I'll start with you, Vic. What is the case about, and what are the legal arguments presented?
So, as you said very helpfully in your setup, this case is about late arriving mail in ballots. So, about 14 or so states, and it's changing over time because states are revising their laws. But currently, about a third of the states and the District of Columbia allow ballots to be counted in federal and state elections if they are postmarked by election day, even if they trickle in the ensuing days, the grace period you referred to. So no one doubts that states can count those ballots for state elections. There's no states have complete control over their administration of elections for state offices. But as to federal offices, of course, Congress has passed statutes that designate what we might call an election day, the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November every 2 years for Congress and every 4 years for president. And the RNC has argued successfully in the lower court and perhaps successfully in the Supreme Court that those statutes that Congress has passed, even though they don't use the term election day, they kind of require that all the ballots be received by the voting authorities by midnight of that designated day, and that they can't be counted if they come in late, even if they were postmarked earlier. Now, I don't think that arguments in support of that are particularly strong. Let me just give two reasons for that. Nobody argues that the counting has to be done by election night. Everyone agrees that a state can count ballots in federal elections in the ensuing day or days as needed. So it's not about being done with everything by midnight of election day. Nor does the RNC argue that everybody has to vote on election day itself. So it's quite clear that this case was not about the permissibility of mail-in ballots generally or early voting, where people might vote a day or a week before the election. They somehow make an argument that it's got to arrive by midnight. And the question is, why would we think that Congress would insist on that? And there's not a really compelling answer to that, assuming we believe that the U.S. mails are secure and that once someone has voted and put their ballot in the mail, that they're done with it and they can't really alter it thereafter. If we trust the security of the mails, it's not clear to me why a mailbox should be treated differently than a lockbox into which you could drop your ballot at noon on election day outside the voting precinct. I'm not sure why a state can't consider those two physical mechanisms the same. And I don't think the RNC had a particularly strong argument against that. There's a little wrinkle we can talk about later. But if it were me, I would probably say there's not evidence that Congress wanted to prevent states from doing what they seem to have been doing, as you pointed out, for many decades in this respect.
Well, Jason, I was going to ask you, so I think oral arguments were a little over a week ago in the case, and I know both you and Vic have watched the arguments. What did you think were the best arguments and toughest questions that each side got? And the other thing I'd like to ask, if it came up, and if you could explain this too, because not only is this case about the grace period for mail-in ballots, but Vic, when he was describing what this case is about, mentioned the postmarking. And I do know that I believe in December, the U.S. Postal Service changed how they are postmarking mail. So I didn't know if that came up in this case.
Yeah, so in terms of how the argument went and the sort of questions that the justices were asking, questions for the state of Mississippi, which is, of course, defending its law. One of the first set of questions started by Justice Thomas explored other ways in which states, if they can do what they're doing in Mississippi, could structure their mechanisms for return of ballots. So Justice Thomas said, well, could the state say you can just give the ballot to a neighbor by election day and have the neighbor transmit it to the election office? Justice Barrett said, "How about to my HOA? Can that person collect all the ballots and then transmit them?" Because the state's argument is that. By election day, under its rules, voters have made their choice, their final choice. They put it in the mail, and the only thing that hasn't happened is it hasn't yet arrived at the election office. The challengers say that, well, if it hasn't arrived yet, there isn't really a final vote because finality, and this was an argument accepted by the Fifth Circuit below, finality requires not just that the voter have cast the vote and made a final choice, but that the ballot actually be in the hands of election officials. I think for the reasons that Vic mentioned, it's not clear why putting it in the mailbox doesn't suffice, why the state could not say we consider the U.S. Postal Service to be essentially an agent of the state, and so we deem that to be essentially in our hands as well. But a lot of questions to the state were, well, if the U.S. Postal Service is good enough, how about a neighbor? Mississippi also allows FedEx to deliver ballots. And so there you don't even have a government official that is receiving the ballots. You don't have that kind of government official. How about other government officials? How about turning the ballot over to a party boss who then get it to the election office? So lots of questions about not just what Mississippi is doing, but what Mississippi's approach might open the door to with respect to other kinds of mechanisms that the states themselves are not currently allowing. And then a series of questions also to Mississippi that went to understandings of the concerns that motivated Congress's adoption of this single election day. And the general story here is that Congress was concerned about fraud, but also concerned about late arriving ballots. Now, there's not a whole lot of fraud, but concerned about even perceptions of fraud. And as you might remember, Mary, and I suspect members of the audience remember, President Trump has long criticized voting by mail in general, and in the 2020 election, pointed to the fact that things looked very good. The map looked really red. And then suddenly, late in the counting, there are all these additional ballots that get counted, and things turn blue, and he loses. So his argument is that, oh, that's because of fraudulent voting with respect to mail in ballots. It's not really the explanation. The explanation has to do with the counting and the timing of when particular ballots are counted. But the single election day argument that RNC is making is based on some theory that Congress really wants finality with respect to the receipt of the ballots on election day itself. There are various questions about historical practices, and we can get into those. Sort of what is the tradition here of mail voting and absentee voting and so on. On the other side, questions for the RNC, so questions about what exactly is your evidence that when Congress enacted these statutes providing for a single election day, that it was ever trying to lock in a single date by which all ballots cast had actually to arrive in the hands of election officials. Doesn't seem to be the case that Congress was insisting that they all be counted on that day. Questions about state uses of drop boxes, which I don't think anybody is questioning. If the state can say you could just stick it in a drop box, why can't it say you can put it in submit at the post office as well? Questions about that go to the justification based on fraud. If the votes are all cast as they are by election day, aren't we just talking about the timing in which we find out the actual result. And nobody can really change the outcome of a mail-in ballot, though there were some questions about the possibility of retrieving mail, which is a sort of complicated and interesting question. But I think, many of the questions were these kinds of line drawing questions. Many of them sounded like policy oriented questions. And I think if you listen to the argument, you sometimes lose a sense of what the actual issue in the case, which is, has Congress preempted this specific kind of practice in Mississippi? And I think, once you focus on that, I think it's hard to make out the case that Congress, for the reasons that Vic mentioned, has actually done that. These other sorts of issues are interesting issues, but I don't know that they all go very directly to the particular question in the case.
Well, I was going to ask you, Vic, like how many states would be impacted by this decision? And also, does this impact the voting of overseas military as well?
So, as I said, about a third of the states allow these late arriving but postmarked by election day ballots to count. But we're not talking necessarily about a large number of ballots. We don't have good data about exactly how many late arriving ballots there are and whether they tend to break Republican versus Democrat. The Republicans are the ones who are challenging this practice in various states, so they assume that these late arriving ballots help Democratic candidates. I'm not remotely sure that that's true. That's not kind of empirically satisfied. But your mention of the overseas military and expat ballots is important because there seems to be, at least at the Fifth Circuit, a general understanding that some of those ballots, as long as they're postmarked by Election Day, can be counted consistent with congressional desires, even if they trickle in after Election Day. So if we're going to count some ballots of military personnel that come in after Election Day, why would we think Congress would want ballots cast by others that are postmarked by Election Day not to be treated the same way? So one of the problems with the RNC's argument, even if you think late arriving ballots are problematic, more generally, why would we think Congress cares about some of the late arriving ballots but not others? And it goes back to Jason's question about what Congress had in mind, and I don't think the RNC has a great theory about that, even though they may win this case. Now, the one thing I'll say is there is a difference between putting a ballot in a lockbox that is run by state election officials versus giving it to your neighbor or an HOA. And that, of course, is the lockbox is
Can you
secure.
just explain for our audience what a HOA
Oh, I'm sorry.
is?
That's the homeowners association,
Oh,
like
okay.
just a
Just making
friend
sure.
or a ballot harvester. They might throw those ballots away. They might tear them up. They might open them and change them. Whereas the lockbox, once the voter puts it in the box, is secure. So the real question is are the mails and UPS and FedEx and DHS, the other companies that are allowed to transport ballots under state law, are they secure like a lockbox is? And the one way in which they might not be all that secure, Jason adverted to this. I didn't know this until I started doing research on this case a few years ago. But strictly speaking, if you put a parcel in the mail, US mail, and you can do the same thing for FedEx, and you pay extra money to have it tracked, you can pull it back from being delivered before it's delivered, but a day or so after you drop it off. So let's imagine you put your letter in the U.S. Postal Service mailbox at 6 p.m. on Election Day. It's postmarked Election Day. And then the next day, you learn of some election results in other states. And you say, shoot, if I had known that the election was going to turn out that way in those other states, I wouldn't have voted the way I did. So then I pay a little extra money and I have USPS decline to deliver it because it's not yet out for delivery. So I can essentially cancel my ballot based on knowledge that I have after Election Day. And Congress seemingly doesn't want us to be making our electoral decisions based on knowledge of results in other states. That's why Congress specifies a specific uniform date of Election Day throughout the country. So that's a little wrinkle that I think Mississippi should have ironed out before this case. In fact, Jason and I wrote an essay saying they should have basically insisted that USPS and FedEx not be able to retrieve or cancel delivery of actual ballots. You could easily do that technologically, and that would iron out that one little wrinkle. But with that aside, it's not clear to me why USPS is not as secure as a Dropbox is, and that's why that's very different than giving it to your neighbor or your homeowners association, because they could interfere with it in the meanwhile. But Mary, your mention of the other kinds of late arriving ballots from other constituencies, like servicemen and women,
Mhm.
if those arrive late and they can count, and there seems to be an acknowledgement that in some circumstances, at least, that they can count, that puts a
Mhm.
lot of pressure on the idea that Congress wouldn't want the rest of us to have that same option. And so, again, I'm not saying that Mississippi is going to win. I'm saying they should win if the court is looking at it very honestly and objectively, in part because the fact that Congress allows those overseas ballots to arrive late
Mhm.
and be counted is evidence that Congress might permit that more generally.
Well,
Just on the impact, Mary, to go back to your question, I do want to emphasize that it's not. I mean, Mississippi is obviously solidly Republican state, and so late arriving, early arriving, not going to make any difference in terms of outcomes in Mississippi. But the states, and there are 14 of them that currently allow for counting of some late arriving ballots. It is a mix of red, blue, purple states, Illinois, Texas, Virginia, New York, Oregon, Alaska. So it's not as though there's just, sort of one-sided group that is doing this. In terms of the numbers of ballots that we're talking about, Vic's right. It's a little hard to get really good information because you're relying upon the states themselves to tell you to turn it over. But I did find one study that I think gives us some sense of this. So in the 2024 election, if you look at 14 of the 22 states and territories in that election that were allowing counting of mailed-in ballots that arrived within a window, there were between 700 and 800,000 ballots that fell in that category. So, maybe if you extrapolate
being
all of
across
the,
all the states,
yeah.
across all the states.
So
Yeah.
this is across all of those 14 states. So
Mhm.
20, there were 22.
22. So
And
now
so
there's fewer than that.
there's
There were
fewer than
14
that because
states
some are
left.
cut back. It's a total, yeah. So it's fewer now. But so maybe you're talking between 1 and 2 million
Yeah.
ballots at the most across all of these states. Now, maybe in some unusual election that makes a difference on the margins in a close House election or something like that. But this is not a huge number of late arriving ballots in a context in which voting by mail is extremely popular. And so it is a small portion even of voting by mail. In terms of the who is voting later in the cycle, that's even harder to get information about. But I did a study of this in 2020, the 2020 election, and turns out that older voters, those over 65, they vote by mail in the highest numbers, but they also vote very early. So they get their ballots in early. The voters who are voting later in the cycle tend to be younger voters and tend also to be independent voters. Democrats in general vote by mail in larger numbers than do Republicans. So, I mean, we have some sense of the demographics. And if the Supreme Court were to rule against Mississippi, in this case, I think there's a legitimate question. What kind of impact might that have going forward in terms of whose ballots actually get counted? Lots of complicated questions there about whether individuals are going to adapt quickly enough and understand what's happened and get their ballots in. But I'm also not all that certain that there's any obvious benefit to either Republicans or Democrats, regardless of how the Supreme Court decides this case. It certainly doesn't matter in Mississippi, but even looking at implications for other states with the possibility of those voters who last time voted late in the cycle, if they had the ability to vote a little earlier in the cycle, they'll still get their ballots in. I suspect it's probably all a wash. And so the actual impact on the outcome of an election, I think the possibility of that is really remote.
Well, we are going to talk about like the impact and stuff, so
Yeah.
I'm glad we kind of previewed it. But I want to go back to Vic and some of the things he said and we were talking about. So it sounds like the argument on behalf of the RNC is that you need to ensure that your ballot is received by a certain day. So wouldn't, so, I mean, let's assume they're correct. I mean, we're not, that's not necessarily true, but let's assume they are. Wouldn't doing priority mail or FedEx when you know it's going to arrive by a certain day just solve that problem?
It would if you mail in your ballot plenty early, or you use some other carrier that gets it there by election day, then you got no problem. But remember, not everybody has the wherewithal to pay the money to use a priority
Yeah.
or 2-day delivery. And as you pointed out earlier, Mary, the USPS, which has never been that reliable, let's be honest, has now acknowledged that they're not even postmarking as readily and quickly as they might use as they maybe did in the past. So you could drop it off in a postal kind of receptacle, assuming it's going to be postmarked that day, but maybe it won't be postmarked until the next day. So that goes back to Jason's point about how quickly voters can adapt to whatever this ruling is and adjust their behavior accordingly, either to vote earlier in the cycle or vote in person or drop off their mail-in ballot in person. Because you don't actually have to, you can fill out your ballot, and then most states that have mail-in voting, you can just drop it off at the precinct in this kind of a lockbox thing without having to stand in line and have your ID checked and all that stuff. So a lot of it depends on how quickly voters can adapt. Relatedly, there's an argument to be made that the court shouldn't be issuing opinions that change the rules so close in time to the fall election, because that doesn't give people time enough to adapt. So people might not really get the word out that they have to drop their ballot in earlier rather than later, et cetera. But there's one point I want to kind of build on based on, Mary, something you said and stuff Jason said. If the outcome, if the effect on actual outcomes and the benefit or harm to either political party is far from clear here, and I think it is far from clear, one one thing that's more clear to me is that um, part of this campaign is about undermining faith in elections generally and in mail-in ballots in particular. So even if this is just a narrow question that doesn't really call into doubt all of the validity of mail-in ballots, just the court saying what states have been doing for decades, as you pointed out, if not centuries, Mayor, if that practice actually has been violative of federal law, that to the uninitiated person, they might say, well, wait a minute, all these elections we've had, how can I trust that they've been kind of legitimate? And so I think that the challengers in these cases are a little less concerned than I would be about the corrosive effect that these kinds of challenges have on confidence in elections more generally, which leads to me to one set of arguments that the Republicans have made here and some of the justices embraced, and that is, well, even if there's not a problem of actual fraud, if there's a perception of fraud, don't we have to base our decision on that perception? Don't we have to eliminate practices that contribute to the perception of fraud because the perception is itself a problem? To which I would say, well, there's two ways to eliminate a perception of fraud. One is to eliminate those practices that lead to a perception. The other way is to debunk the perception and explain to the American people, as Jason just did, that just because someone could lead in the vote counting at 10 p.m. and then lose at 2 a.m. doesn't mean that there's anything fishy going on. It just means that the ballots that were counted late might come from different parts of the state and different demographics. I think the court should view its job to do that, as well as to kind of acknowledge and deal with the fact that some people have skepticism. So again, I don't know that the outcome of this case is going to change that many elections. But I just don't like the idea that what states have been doing has been invalid, when I don't think that's what Congress necessarily intended.
Yeah, and Vic, you kind of alluded to this, and I'll ask Jason. Um, should we understand this case to be the first step in an effort to undermine voting by mail in general?
It's a really interesting question, and so it's something that I've thought a bit about. Because I mean, you just sort of think about the parties here. We have RNC versus Mississippi, and so the sort of critique of mail-in voting is one that comes largely from the Republican side. This is something that President Trump has pushed for a long time. He and his supporters have claimed repeatedly that it was because of mail-in voting that he lost the 2020 election. And so it's certainly the case that the RNC's goal in this particular case is to end this practice of counting late arriving ballots. But I do think there's some suspicion that this is sort of the first step in getting rid of all mail voting. I think that's a much harder mountain to climb, in large part because, as I said, this is such a popular, every state allows this in some form. Every state has liberalized the ability to vote by mail, particularly since COVID, when lining up at the polls was very problematic. And then you have Mississippi, which is a red state, controlled by Republicans in every branch of government, that is defending a state law that it does allow for late arriving ballots. Uh, uh, um, and so, there's been some suspicion that, oh, maybe Mississippi is a kind of willing participant in an effort to get a ruling that would result in the invalidity of counting late arriving ballots, which wouldn't affect Mississippi, but would potentially affect other states where this is happening. But I don't think that that's the case here. I think Mississippi has a strong interest in defending its own law. And I think there are broad federalism issues here as well. So we're talking about one particular issue, but this is a part and parcel of a general set of questions about the authority of the states under the Constitution to run elections the way that they want, unless they are preempted by federal law. And so I think Mississippi has a strong interest in defending that proposition. And as best as I can tell, Mississippi is indeed vigorously defending its state law, and it is hoping to win. It hasn't thrown the match. If we sort of think ahead and think, well, if Mississippi loses, will the next thing be a general challenge to all mail-in voting? That implicates, I think, every form of early voting, because, if you're mailing in your ballot, you can't time it perfectly so that it's going to arrive on election day. So then you're talking also about potential problems with respect to absentee voting, which again is a very in-person absentee voting, again, a very popular form of voting. Most people don't vote at the polls on election day. This is a third of voters who do that. I don't really see any real possibility of the Supreme Court at any time in the near future reading the election day language of the federal statutes to say that everybody must actually physically cast a vote on election day, neither before, neither later. And because of that reason, I don't think there's really any sound prospect of leveraging a result in this case to go after early voting or mail-in voting in general. These were questions that, as I said, were directed at the challenges, but I think the questions were directed at the challenges because it cast doubt on the strength of their argument about this particular aspect of what states are doing as being problematic.
Well,
So
I was going to ask, we did get a question in the Q&A. The question is, did our old familiar from law school mailbox rule issue come up? Did that come up during oral argument, Vic?
yeah, sure. And in the briefs and in the lower court opinion, because putting something in a mailbox and having it count as of that day is not unique to ballots. For example, we mail our taxes by April 15th, and they may not arrive to the place that opens up the envelopes and cashes the checks for several days thereafter. But we consider that postmark good enough. And the RNC says, well, taxes is not the same as voting, and we want more security in voting. And I get that there might be differences and the like, but definitely the state of Mississippi did invoke the mailbox rule as an analogy for contracts and for tax filings and the like. But let me go back to something Jason said in response to your last question. Um, I think the question of mail-in voting as a general matter, took on a lot more of a partisan cast after COVID. Because if you'd asked me 10 years ago, who are the beneficiaries of mail in voting? I would have said it's elderly people who don't go to the precinct. They get a mail in ballot. In fact, some states like Texas automatically make you eligible to vote by mail in if you're over 65, but not under 65, which I think is unconstitutional because the 26th Amendment says age should not be a factor in voting. But the Fifth Circuit, the same circuit that ruled in this case, had a really ill-considered ruling a handful of years ago upholding that Texas statute. But in general, before COVID, it was older people who voted by mail and younger people voted in person. And older people tended to be Republican, right? The only age demographic that Donald Trump won in 2016 was people over 65. All the other age demographics were either even or he lost. But then during COVID, because Democrats seemed more leery of in person gatherings, they took Anthony Fauci more seriously. They were more worried about getting sick. In part because they had in-person jobs that they couldn't avoid, and they lived in extended family arrangements where they had elderly people in the home that they didn't want to infect. All these reasons led Democrats to be more skittish, and that's why they were not as troubled by the closure of schools than Republicans were. And so during 2020 and COVID, Democrats used mail-in voting a lot more than Republicans. And what we have now for President Trump and people in his orbit is a holdover. They now associate mail-in with Democrats and people who used it extensively in COVID. But I'm not sure that that's true enduringly going forward. Let me give you one analogy. Everyone assumes that the Electoral College helps Republicans vis-a-vis a national popular election because in 2016, Donald Trump won, even though Hillary Clinton got more votes. And in 2000, George Bush won, even though Al Gore got more votes. So you say to yourself, oh, okay, the Electoral College is good for the Republicans. That's not necessarily true. In 2004, George W. Bush beat John Kerry by 3 million votes nationwide. He clearly won the popular vote. But if the weather had been better in Ohio and turnout would have been a little higher in Ohio, Kerry would have won Ohio and he would have won the White House. So the Electoral College could have bitten the Republicans just as easily. And that's why I say I think there's a lot of assumptions that go into the Save America Act proposals and this lawsuit here that may not correlate with empirical reality. Even in red states, it's not clear to me that Democrats use mail-in voting more than Republicans. The fact that more Democrats vote mail-in than Republicans may just be a function of the fact that more blue states allow mail-in than red states, even though there's some of both. But within a given state, it's not clear to me that Democrats use it more aggressively than Republicans do. And certainly, we don't have data on tardy mailers, that is, people who mail late in the cycle. So again, I don't think this is likely to affect many elections, but it does affect the national perceptions about our election integrity and legitimacy. And I hope the court, whatever it does, writes an opinion that is sensitive to that.
Well, we got about 10 more minutes. I want to ask a couple last questions about this case, and then I want to save a little bit of time to ask about the executive order that the president issued this week. So I'm going to ask both of you to be like a human Kalshi and predict. So Vic, the arguments were last week. How do you think the Supreme Court's going to rule?
I think it'll probably be 6-3 on partisan lines, or maybe 5-4 with Barrett or the chief going with the three Democratic appointees. That probably rule in favor of the RNC.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is not one that I have. I like in the birthright citizenship today case today. I have a high degree of confidence that the birthright citizenship order will never go into effect. This one I wouldn't want to bet, but you're forcing me to say what I think will happen. To the extent that oral argument is sometimes predictive, I would say probably. But here's the important caveat, Mary. Sometimes a justice may think they want to vote a certain way, but as the judge for whom I clerked on the Ninth Circuit told me sometimes, he said, "Well, we'll have
Yeah,
to see how it writes." Well,
right.
how do you write an opinion? You got to write it up. And I used to say to him, "What do you mean, see how it writes? It doesn't write itself. I'm the one who has to draft it for you. What are you talking about here?" So, but sometimes we'll have to wait and see how the draft circulate. This
Yeah.
could be one of those cases where there's some movement among the justices.
Well, and what's your prediction, Jason?
Most of the news reports suggested that the Mississippi law was going to go down 6-3. I listened to the argument. I wasn't so sure about that. I thought certainly there were three on one side, three on the other, but I thought Roberts, Kavanaugh, and Barrett didn't really tip their hand as clearly as they might have. And I think Vic's observation is exactly right. The challenge here is whether you can write up an opinion that holds that just this kind of law is preempted, but doesn't lead to the conclusion that all of the other things that states are doing are not preempted, particularly for going back to your question, Mary, other kinds of early voting, mail voting in general, that those are not affected. And I think also writing up an opinion that isn't going to cast doubt on outcomes in prior elections. If you hold this thing invalid as preempted by federal law, well, what do you make of the most recent elections in which states were counting these ballots? And that may be a hard thing to write. And so I think Mississippi may lose in the end, but I suspect, as Vic does, that there's maybe a bit of movement between oral argument and the ultimate outcome in the case. So still possible that Mississippi will prevail.
Okay, well, I want to save a few minutes and talk about the executive order that the president issued regarding voting this week. So, Vic, can you explain to our audience what it actually says and if you think it's constitutional?
So the order was issued just very recently, and it's long and detailed, and I haven't gone through it carefully yet. But its basic outlines essentially require for mail-in ballots require the U.S. Postal Service to work together with the Department of Homeland Security to develop some rules and some technologies to ensure that only people who are validated as U.S. citizens by DHS are eligible to vote by mail through USPS. So it's kind of a joint initiative between the Postal Service and DHS to identify only citizens who can vote in federal elections. Um, I think the basis for an executive order here is far from clear. I don't think constitutionally the president has any role to play. Uh, Article 1, Section 4 does say Congress may, by law, provide for the times, place, and manner of congressional elections, but it's not clear to me what statute Congress has passed that the president could be plausibly claiming to be implementing or enforcing here. Um, I also think this question about non-citizens can vote and that non-citizens don't vote bumps up against the state's constitutional power to decide who gets to vote. Because Article 1, Section 4 says the times, place, and manner of federal elections are set by states, but they can be overridden by Congress, by law. But as to who gets to vote, Article 1, Section 2 gives that to states entirely. It says the qualifications for voters in congressional elections are determined by who gets to vote in state elections. So this may be a who question rather than a how to vote question, in which case I'm not sure that the federal government has any role to play here. On top of all that, I just don't see this coming together remotely in time for the November election because there's a notice and comment period that the USPS has to go through before it finalizes any rule. And after that, states have 90 days to let the federal government know whether it's going to allow for mail-in ballots. And then after that, USPS has to work with DHS to have this technological fix. I don't see any of that happening, which is why, even though it's going to be challenged in court maybe as early as today or tomorrow, I'm not sure that the courts will find the case to be ripe yet, in part because the USPS hasn't promulgated a rule. I personally, and on record, is saying I would relax ripeness limitations because challenges to election rules need to be resolved earlier rather than later so that we're not changing things right before an election. That's the so-called Purcell principle that we don't want to change the rules named after a Supreme Court case right before an election. So I think standing and ripeness should be viewed generously when you're litigating over election-related matters. But I'm not sure all courts will see it that way. So we might not get judicial responses to this until USPS actually promulgates a rule in the next 3 or 4 months.
Can I just add
Yeah,
one quick thing about this? So, Vic talked a lot about the power of the president and what the postal service is supposed to do. If we focus on the things that are going to impact the individual voter, this procedure that seems to be envisaged by this executive order is so incredibly convoluted that I don't have a lot of confidence that voters are going to be able to effectively make use of it. And so I think additional point of challenge is that this is really undermining access to the ballot. The voter has to make sure that his or her name is on the state list and then that it's transmitted to the federal list. Then there has to be this special envelope designed by the state that you have to use. There has to be this checking when you mail that you've mailed it in and the barcode corresponds to the name of somebody who's on the list. So all of these additional kinds of steps that the individual voter has to undergo in order to cast a ballot, I think are independently problematic.
well, thanks so much to the two of you. We're kind of wrapping up now, so I'm going to do a lightning round. You both, with caveats, predicted that the Mississippi rule is going to be invalidated and gone are the days of the grace periods. So if that's the case, and we have elections coming up in November, what's your final thoughts to our audience and to, frankly, any voter? How should they adapt to this? Like, I'll start with you, Jason.
Um, Pay attention to what's happening, but I think more importantly, plan for the possibility and tell your neighbors that there may be a Supreme Court decision coming down that's going to shut off that window that you described, Mary. And so that means getting your ballot in early if you're mailing it. If you're not mailing it, make use of some other mechanism that your state makes available, whether it's early in person or whether instead of dropping it at the post office, you put it in the ballot box. So I think pay attention and plan ahead because I think and tell people. I think that getting the word out is really critical to this.
Well,
And I would,
Vic, I'll let you do brief final thoughts
yeah,
for
I
our
would just
audience.
thank you, Mary, and thanks again for convening this. I would just add to what Jason said the following. Um, when you plan ahead, plan for unexpected contingencies. So, one of the reasons that we had a significant number of late arriving mail in ballots in 2020 is because people expected to be able to vote in person, but then the pandemic took an unexpected turn in their little area and they didn't want to be part of a crowd. And so they decided to vote by mail, but now they're voting by mail kind of on election day and it's not going to be received for 3 or 4 days thereafter. So even if you expect to vote in person, rethink that and say, if I'm planning on voting in person, maybe I'll just fill out the ballot instead and drop it off in a mailbox, 4 or 5 days before, or make time to drop it off at the precinct the day of the election rather than my local mailbox. So build in the not just plan what you want to do, but recognize that your plans could change because of things outside your control, whether it's the weather, whether it's because of illness that's specific to you or your family, or whether it's some more cataclysmic event like an emerging pandemic.
Well, thanks so much to both of you, Vic and Jason. I really appreciate it. And obviously, for our audience, you see all these issues couldn't be more timely. We discussed the RNC versus Watson case and the executive order that was issued this week, and then even the this morning's argument on the birthright citizen case. So thank you so much to both of you. And I'll say, if you all enjoyed this program, please go to the Task Force for American Democracy's website at www.democracy-taskforce.org and sign up for our newsletter. We will be presenting future webinars, and we hope you will join us again. Our next webinar will be on April 28th at 1 p.m. Eastern, and we will be joined by another task force member, Richard Haas, who is President Emeritus of the Council of Foreign Relations. And we will be discussing what we can learn from other countries that have fought back against authoritarian forces, the rule of law is applied by the U.S. in international settings, and how that relates to its application domestically. Big issue that many of us are thinking about, the legality of the Iraq War, and about all of our obligations as citizens, that as was reflected in Richard's book. You can also support the task force at www.democracy-taskforce.org. And thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
folks.
you, Mary.
Bye bye.